All right. So, as Stephanie mentioned, my name is David Howell, and today I'll be talking about our most recent release of the population estimates that came out earlier this month and some demographic trends that we've been seeing around the state, and then kind of some borough and census area specific information. So, here we have Alaska's total population from 1946 through 2022. And as you can see, the state of Alaska has grown considerably during this time. And that has pretty much been the default for Alaska is population growth. We've only lost population for 6 years during this time, here highlighted by the blue bars. And as you can see, 4 of those years were in the most recent decade. Now, the losses during the most recent decade started in 2016, and these losses were very small. So we were losing less than 1% of our population a year, well, much less than 1% of our population a year during that time. But this was still notable just because we have gained population so steadily throughout our time as a state. And so the more recent times that we've lost population, we couldn't really point to a reason why we were losing population. So in the past, when we lost population, there was a pretty definitive event that took place that caused us to lose population, or that we could look back on and say, oh, that's why we lost population. So in the 1970s, we had this massive workforce come into the state, and they were here to work on the oil pipeline. And so we have all these workers coming up. They're here to do one job specifically, and that is to create this oil pipeline for the state of Alaska. So when that was completed, we saw a population decline. This was not surprising. These people were up here for one specific purpose. Once that was done, then they left the state. So no real surprise there, as the people had come for a very specific reason. Then in the 1980s, we lost population again. This wasn't something that we could have predicted. We had this boom in oil, lots of population growth for the state of Alaska, and then the bottom kind of falls out on oil. And so we see Alaska looks a lot less stable to people. And so these people have just moved up here. And so no surprise that once things look a little unstable, they leave the state and potentially go back to where they're come from, or somewhere that looks a little better for their futures. But again, in this most recent time, we don't have a single thing that we can point to say this is why specifically we lost population for those 4 years in a row. And we have gained population since 2020. So between 2020 and 2022, the state of Alaska added about 2,500 people. This is not a lot of growth for the state of Alaska. Historically speaking, we would grow considerably more than that on an annual basis. And there are a few reasons why we're pretty uncertain if this is a real break in the trend of population losses, or if this is related to kind of one-off events. As you all know, we've had this influx of military personnel to the Eielson Air Force Base with the F-35 troop transfer. So that led to a lot of in-migration to the state that we might not have seen otherwise, and pretty much allowed the state to grow. It's also tough to untangle some of these population trends from the most recent COVID-19 pandemic. So here we have Alaska's in and out migration represented by the columns, and then the net migration represented by this orange line going from 2000 through 2022. Now, on an annual basis, Alaska sees more gross migration, and gross migration is just in migration plus out migration. So your total number of people moving in and out of the state is your gross migration. So Alaska experiences more gross migration than any other state on an annual basis. We experience over 10% of our population coming in and out of the state on any given year. So 10% of the population moving in or out of the state in any year. Now, the 2000s were pretty normal for Alaska as far as that time period goes, from the 90s to 2000s. Net migration bounced right around zero. So some years we would gain, other years we would lose population. And this allowed for a lot of population growth for the state of Alaska, in that we are able to gain through what's called natural increase, which is just births outnumbering deaths. So as long as that net migration is not too negative, we gain population very readily from natural increase. And as you can see, in the 2000s, just under 40,000 people in and out of the state each year. And then once we get to 2008, we start to see the impacts of the Great Recession that's occurring down south. So if you remember this time, our economy was quite a bit stronger because oil prices were higher. And so our economy was doing much better than the lower 48. And so what we have happened here is you see these immigrants starting to come into the state. And so we are gaining population, just lots of population gains through migration at that time. But it is for a very specific reason. These people are moving up here to escape the impacts of the Great Recession. Maybe they've lost their jobs. Maybe their jobs are looking, much less stable. There's maybe better paying jobs here in Alaska. Whatever the reason is, we see this massive influx of people from down south come up to Alaska during this time period. And this time of pretty big in-migration continues through 2013. And at that time, the lower 48 has recovered from the Great Recession, and we start to see people leaving the state. They're going back to where they came from. They moved here. They never really put down roots. And so we see them starting to leave the state at that time. And at the same time, our in-migration starts to decline. So as you can see here in 2014, we have a pretty considerable drop in in-migrants. This levels out for a couple of years. And then in 2016, while the out-migrants are still quite elevated, we are really start to lose the number of people coming into the state. And that's when we start to lose population. So it's not that, so the outs are still elevated at this time. We're still losing quite a few people, more than historically so. But the bigger story is we're just not gaining people like we were in the past. So that causes this net migration to drop down considerably, which basically we're not able to grow from natural increase at that time. Our births outnumbering deaths are no longer enough to provide population growth. Now, between 2020 and 2021, as we all know, the pandemic shut down a lot of things. And so we had kind of muted in and out migration. And this is just because that the reasons that people moving for, going off to college or moving for a job, a lot of these things went remote, or people, were not hiring because of the uncertainty caused by the pandemic. And so the reasons that people tend to move were not there. So we did not see a whole lot of moves in or out of the state between 2020 and 2021. Now, our in-migration was, of course, aided by that troop transfer of the F-35s to Eielson. So we gained more in-migrants than we would have without that transfer, which allowed us to gain population. And now during 2021 to 22, we saw the country start to open back up. And so all around the country, there was a lot of migration. Domestic migration was up considerably over pre-pandemic levels. And so Alaska was no different. We actually had the most in-migrants that we've had since 2013 between 2021 and 2022. And what's happening here is we're opening back up. We have cruise ships are back in Southeast Alaska. Tourism's more fully open. We have our seafood processing plants are now operating at normal capacity. And so they have to bring in more workers from when they were operating at reduced levels to stop the spread of COVID. And so in Alaska, we're able to track our migrants in a way that other states are not. So here we have average annual net migration from 2007 to 2012 by age based on PFD applications. Now, at this time, as I mentioned, we're gaining a lot of people from the Great Recession down south. So we have all these workers. So just, I guess, for reference, this red line is 0. Anything below that, we're losing population. Anything above that, we are gaining population. We have the youngest ages on the left, oldest ages on the right. And so Alaska historically gains population at the early working ages, so 20s through early 30s. Traditionally, we would not be gaining at these late 30s, almost up to 50. These are ages where we typically would be losing population or falling right around 0. But because of factors down south, we're seeing these people moving up here. These are people who would normally be in stable jobs, working, not moving, raising families. They would traditionally stay where they are. So we don't normally see gains at these ages, but we do during this time period. Now, the senior ages, kind of retirement years, we've always lost population at these ages and will likely continue to do so. I don't think we're going to become a retirement destination anytime soon. So we will continue to lose population at these ages as we always have. And then during this time, we're gaining population at these youngest ages as these kids are being brought up with their parents. 2012 to 2017, this is a time when people are starting to leave the state. So we're no longer gaining at these older working, or not older, but mid working ages like we were during 2007 to 2012, but we are gaining at these younger working ages. We're now losing population at these youngest age group. And this is more of a function of Alaska's fertility rates being higher than the lower 48. So basically, families moving out are bringing more kids with them than families moving in. So we get a net loss due to more kids moving out than in, even if there was the same number of families going each way. And this big drop here at the senior population, this isn't that we're seeing a big jump in the rate of people moving out of the state at these ages. What's happening is we now have more people at these ages than we have historically. So the rate is staying the same. We just have more people being impacted by that rate. And that is due directly to the aging of the baby boomer population, which largely moved up to Alaska in the 80s and 90s, and then worked here, aged in place, and then have now started leaving the state as they've hit these traditional retirement ages. Now, 2017 to 2022 looks quite similar to 2012 to 2017. So a few differences here. We're not as many people at these senior ages left. And I think that's directly attributable to the pandemic. We just, again, people put moves on hold. There's a lot of uncertainty during several of these years. And so we just saw less people moving. And I think seniors tended to stay in place a little bit more so than other people. They're moving for different reasons than a person in their working ages would be moving traditionally. Also notable, we are now losing population in this 15-19, 20-24, quite a bit more than we were in that previous time period. But this is still an improvement over the years when Alaska was losing population. Between 2015 and 2020, we actually lost population at every age. So even this 25 to 29 age group was negative. And for 2017 to 2022, this is the only positive age group. This 30 to 4 age group is just barely negative, just below zero. So pretty negligible, but still losing population at all ages except for 25 to 29. So rates of net migration vary considerably around the state. As we all know, Mat-Su is a big gainer of net migrants, and that is to the detriment of Anchorage. Most people don't move from the lower 48 directly to Mat-Su. What happens is they move to Anchorage, and then after living in Anchorage for some time, kind of find their way to the Mat-Su Valley. Southeast Alaska traditionally loses small amounts of population to net migration. The one standout here is Skagway. Skagway, during the last decade, was one of our fastest growing boroughs or census areas in the state, and gaining lots of population through net migration. And at this time, they've actually lost 5% of their population to net migration between 2021 and 2022. And this is directly attributable to the pandemic. So Skagway, as you may know, it's a very small town, very reliant on the cruise ship industry. And so with the shutdown of the cruise ship industry for essentially 2 years, it's just taken a toll on Skagway's population. So as they were one of the fastest growing areas, they're now losing population to net migration due to a lack of jobs in the area. And now, cruise ships came back this past summer, and they're projecting that we might see record numbers next year. So it's likely that Skagway will start to grow again in the near future. So the Kenai Borough is also gains population from Anchorage. It's kind of interesting. We see older migrants moving from Anchorage to Kenai. So what it looks like is people are hitting those retirement ages and they're moving down to the Kenai Peninsula. This makes a lot of sense. Just if you're going to retire in Alaska, it's because you want to be around these outdoor activities. So why not move closer to them? So we see the kind of an older group of migrants moving from Anchorage to Kenai. And again, Anchorage has been losing population and migration for quite some time. This most recent year, the migration losses were quite a bit less than they have in the past, but still slight losses to net migration. In the interior region, Southeast Fairbanks has been growing pretty quickly the last few years. It had been on a streak of losses last decade, but has been growing recently. The Fairbanks North Star Borough, you guys lost a little bit of population to net migration between 2021 and 22. And last decade, Fairbanks was losing population to net migration, but with the influx of personnel to Eielson, 2020 to 2022, we would see positive net migration for the borough, but this is 21 to 22. So there's some slight losses there. And this is kind of due to a one-off event that I'll talk more about later in the presentation. So rural Alaska typically loses population to migration. So the northern region out west, we generally see small migration losses. But in these most recent years, we've seen the migration losses to be considerably more than they were in the past. Generally, the North Slope, Northwest Arctic, Bethel, they'd be losing around 1% of their population, but now they're all over 3% of their population leaving due to net migration. And again, we have PFD data, so we've kind of taken a look at this a little bit. What it looks like is it's people in their working ages bringing their kids. So it looks like people are moving for jobs. I can't say for certain that that's what's happening, but it looks like based on the age profile that these people fit the right age young workers that would be mobile, moving around for work. And speaking of moving for work, the Aleutians East Borough saw the strongest amount of net migration, and this is definitely not normal. What's happened here is the seafood processors were operating at reduced levels due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and now 2022, they're back fully open, and so we've seen this influx of workers to work in those facilities out there. And this is going to be an interesting area, Aleutians East and Aleutians West, to watch over the coming years. I'm sure it was all over the news, was the crab fishery closure out there. And so there's a lot of these small communities that are very reliant on the fishing industry. And so if these closures go on for some time, we will start to see impacts because there just won't be the tax base out there to provide for those communities like they have in the past. So it'll be very interesting to see where this goes in the coming future. So births and deaths are something that we generally think that we have a pretty good grasp on. We think we can predict them pretty well. But as the COVID-19 pandemic showed us, we can't. There's things outside of our control that we just won't be able to predict. As you can see from the year 2000 through 2020, this yellow line is our deaths. And as you can see, it just steadily climbs during that time. And this is not that mortality rates are ticking up. It's just that historically, we haven't had a very large population at ages where mortality rates are quite high. And so as we get more and more people at these older ages, we would expect deaths to go up. So this was a very predictable climb. Now, what isn't predictable at all was this jump from 2020 to 2022. Now, between 2019 and 2020, we had about 4,600 deaths to Alaskans during that time. 2022 or 2021 to 2022, this number has now jumped to 6,400 deaths. It's a 39% increase over pre-pandemic levels, and was actually about 1,000 deaths higher than the 2020 to 2021 period. And this is just because that the Delta variant really had a huge impact on mortality rates during that time. Thankfully, mortality rates have declined. We think that deaths will remain elevated going forward, but to what extent, we really don't know. It's very difficult. It's basically impossible to tell where we're going with that, but we do think that deaths will remain elevated, but we probably won't fall directly back down to this pre-pandemic level anytime soon, or I guess for Alaska ever, just because there are more and more people at these older ages. Now, births also have been a little bit unpredictable for Alaska. So the 2000s, we start to see an uptick in births there about the middle of the decade. And this isn't that fertility rates are all of a sudden climbing. It's that we have this large millennial cohort that is now starting to hit their prime birth ages. So that's prime birth years are kind of your 20s through early 30s. And so as they hit these ages, we just see, numerically speaking, more births because we have more women at these prime birth years to have children. And so this flattens out. And then we start to see a decline in births beginning in about the middle of the last decade. And this is due to twofold reason. We do have decreasing fertility rates beginning in 2015, but also the millennials are now aging into their late 30s. And so, a little bit less likely to have children. And the generation behind them is considerably smaller. So there's just going to be less and less people at these high birth years to have children. And so we see this steep decline in births beginning in about 2016. At this point, births are falling by nearly 500 a year. So pretty considerable drops. This starts to level out 200 to 300 a year. And then in this most recent period, we actually saw births decline by less than 100. But again, with the pandemic, we're not sure if this is a true leveling off or not. Birth rates are staying about the same, 21 to 22. But we don't know if this is because of delayed pregnancies. So during 2020, lots of uncertainty caused by the pandemic, and we know uncertainty traditionally causes fertility rates to decline. And so it could be that people just are delaying having children and are now starting to, now that things are returning to normal. So it'll be a few years before we really know if this is a true trend change or if it's just a delayed births due to the pandemic. Now, like net migration, rates of natural increase vary greatly around the state. And actually, some of our boroughs and census areas do experience what's referred to as natural decrease, which is where deaths outnumber births. Now, natural decrease is quite uncommon in Alaska. This is a one-off year. Again, as I mentioned, deaths are up considerably, 21 to 22. And so boroughs and census areas experience more deaths than normal. But natural decrease down south, it's very common. More than half of counties experience natural decrease in the lower 48. It's just something that's very new to Alaska. Southeast Alaska is an area of the state that is older than the rest of the state, and they also have lower birth rates than much of the state. So some of these boroughs and census areas experience natural decrease here and there. But between 2021 and 2022, about half of the boroughs and census areas of Southeast Alaska experienced natural decrease during that time. So, but much of the state is still growing from natural increase. Chugach, Anchorage, Matsu, all growing. Notably, Kenai actually experienced natural decrease. This is by I think it's like 2 deaths more than births for Kenai. So this is definitely not normal for Kenai to lose population to natural decrease, but it's just something that we saw in this most recent period with deaths being up. Much of the interior experiences strong growth from natural increase. Fairbanks, large military population, large student population, so lots of people in those prime birthing ages, not too many on the older end, so definitely a strong growth from natural increase. Denali, fairly young population, lots of growth from natural increase. But the strongest growers from natural increase are in northern and western Alaska. So Kusilvik has one of the highest fertility rates in the country, with on average, women have about 4 children in their lifetime out there. So that is considerably higher than much of the rest of the state and definitely higher than the rest of the country outside of Utah. But other strong growers are generally in the northern region. Northwest Arctic has seen a pretty considerable drop in their births, and that's what's causing this. It's not necessarily an uptick in deaths out here. It's just kind of a downtick in births in the region. But as I say, most of the state in general grows from a natural increase. So how has the population changed during this time? So I'll go through a series of population pyramids. And if you've never seen one of these, how this works is we have the oldest ages up top, youngest ages on the bottom. We have males on the left, females on the right. And this top bar, just for reference, this is 85 plus. So all of these other bars represent single years of age. And so this is everyone 85 and above. So that's why it's quite a bit bigger. And as I go through these, you'll really see this 85 plus bar start to grow. Now, a few things to point out. As I mentioned, Alaska has a very large baby boomer population. In the year 2000, these people would be in about their mid 50s to mid 30s. So right there in their prime working ages. Then we have Generation X below them, so quite a bit smaller. And then we have the millennial generation turning 19 through about 5 years old or so at this time period. So we can see pretty distinctly these 3 generations. And as I mentioned, just not that many people at these older ages when mortality rates are the highest. So that's why we saw deaths increase since 2000 as more people age into these age groups. So 2000, then we go to 2005. Some population growth, but mostly just aging here. 2005 to 2010, kind of interesting. You can really see the effects of that migration during that time when the Great Recession was occurring. We start to become a little bit squarer here in the middle compared to 2005. And then again in 2010, the most notable thing here is the baby boomers start to turn 65. And so this is something that we knew was coming and had somewhat planned for, but Alaska has not had a very large 65 plus population. So beginning in 2010, we really started to see that population grow. 2010 to 2015, Again, starting to age 2020. So here you can see the population pyramid got a little bit thinner just because of a few years of population losses. And then here we are in 2022. As you can see, this 85 plus bar, as I mentioned, has gotten considerably larger. Millennials are now getting up into their 40s, so aging out of those highest birth years. And then this generation below them, again, considerably smaller, so just kind of less people at these prime birth years to have kids, just as a numerically speaking number. And then since 2015, we've seen births really starting to fall. So here you can really start to see that impact down here at the lowest ages, where this is really starting to tuck in. And this decline in births is going to have an impact on the school age population very soon. This has been all over the news. I know Fairbanks went through closing a couple of schools a few years ago. Anchorage was talking about closing 6 schools recently, but it sounds like they're only going to close 1. But these conversations will be continuing because this is a trend that is not necessarily going to be stopping and maybe accelerating, as at this point right now, we have about 1,500 more 17-year-olds than we do 0-year-olds. So there's a lot more people at that 17 age group than the kids aging into school over the next few years. So the year 2000, this is a high point for school age population in Alaska. And what's happening here is that big millennial age group is all in the school age years. Well, there's a few who've aged out, but basically they're all in school at this time. 2000, 2005, we start to see them graduating, going into the working ages. Continue graduating. We see drops 2005 to 2010. Then 2010, millennials kids start to hit school. So we see a little bit of growth here, but millennials don't have the same fertility rates as their parents or their parents' parents. So it's pretty levels off despite there being a lot of people at these prime birth ages. A little bit of growth between 2020 and 2022, but again, I wouldn't expect to see this continued growth at the school age population. This will likely start declining again, barring some change. Obviously we could have a mass amount of in-migration or something happen, and that would lead to an uptick in the school age population. But here we have the 0 to 4-year-olds. So again, 2000, millennials still in school, out of this age group. We start to see growth in this age group as millennials hit their prime birth years. And then we start to see this age group declining. So 2015 to 2020, births are down considerably. So we see this big drop. Births have continued to decline since 2020. So we have another quite large drop. And these are the kids that will be going into school in the next few years. So we will see declines in the school age population going forward. Now, another group that's been on the news quite a bit, at least this summer when everyone was trying to hire, is this working age population. So we had strong growth in the 2000s in the working age population because of the aging of the millennials. There was also the growth from the Great Recession. We have people moving into the state at these ages. So lots of growth between 2000 and 2010 for the working age population. 2010 to 2015, this a little bit of growth, but starts to level off. And as I mentioned earlier, at this time, the baby boomers start to turn 65. So we start to see this declining quite considerably during that 5-year period, and then a little bit between 2020 and 2022. And at this point in our age structure, we have about the same amount of people age 18 as we do 64. So we're not growing based on people aging into this age group. We're losing the same number that are aging in on an annual basis. So not a lot of growth from aging as we have in the past. As I mentioned, 65 plus population, lots of growth in this group. And this is going to continue for the rest of the decade. Alaska actually has a baby boomer population that skews younger. So numerically speaking, we will see more and more people turning 65. And that's because our baby boomer population moved here in the 80s and 90s. At that time, the oldest baby boomers were already in their 40s. At that point, you're typically not moving too much. So we ended up with those younger baby boomers coming in to fill the jobs in the growing state of Alaska. But the story over this next decade will really be the growth in the 75 plus population. So here we have the estimated 75 plus population and then our population projections out to 2040 for the 75 plus population. So this group has grown fairly steadily over recent years. But as you can see, we're projecting it to grow quite considerably. And these are people that don't move a whole lot. So once you hit, get in your 70s, 80s, people don't tend to move. So this age group will grow considerably. No matter what happens with migration trends, we will see a lot of growth in this age group going forward. Over the next 20 years, we are expecting this group to go from about 30,000 in 2020 up to over 70,000 in 2040. And this is a group that needs a totally different level of care than 65 plus population. So we will have to adapt to provide the resources that these people need in order to keep them in the state during this time. So how have the boroughs and census areas changed since the most recent census? It varies greatly, as you can imagine, from the natural increase and net migration maps. I'll kind of go through this regionally. The Southeast region has overall lost population. One note here, Haines, I've left Haines off of this map because we thought there was a pretty systematic undercount in the Haines borough during the 2020 census. And so our estimates are quite a bit higher than the census, which makes it look like they're experiencing a lot of population growth, when in fact we think Haines is staying pretty flat. So not really growing, not really declining, just keeping the status quo there. But the other boroughs in the areas of Southeast, in general, are losing small amounts of population. Skagway, again, stand out here. They are the 8%, so they're the biggest loser here. But I think with the returning of the cruise ship industry, we'll see more stability in Skagway. So they'll likely stop losing population and probably start to gain population again going forward. Matsu, no surprise, this has been the fastest growing borough for decades. Just steady growth in the Matsu area. Much of this area growing quite considerably. Anchorage has now lost population for 6 years in a row. This most recent losses that Anchorage has seen, though, has been quite small compared to the losses later or in the latter part of the last decade. The interior region, quite a bit of growth here. Fairbanks, obviously growing with the Eielson troop transfer. And it's tough to say what will happen there. At this point, we think all of those troops have been moved into the borough. And so there won't be necessarily like big growth from that source anyway, going forward. The more rural areas of the state have lost population. This is somewhat surprising. Generally, the rural areas of the state are able to grow based on natural increase more than making up for losses to net migration. But as I mentioned, their losses to net migration have been quite higher than they have in the past. And notably, Kuslovec and Bethel, these were two of the fastest growing census areas in the state between 2010 and 2020. So it's quite surprising to see them losing population since the most recent census. Now, the fastest growing borough is actually Aleutians East. And this is a one-off thing. It's totally related to group quarters facilities out there. Again, as the seafood processors opened back up, workers moved into the area. And so we see a lot of growth out there just due to growth from returning to normal from the pandemic. But in general, the Aleutians East and Aleutians West, there's a little bit of growth, a little bit of population loss, but generally not much change because the population out there is so related to the fishing industry. It's not driven by the same forces that other boroughs and census areas are, which would just be births, deaths, and migration. There's a lot of external factors that account for population growth or decline in the Aleutians. So talk a bit about Fairbanks in particular. Fairbanks is interesting in the state in that it is an urban borough, but so much of the population is tied to the university or the military. So lots of, drivers of growth that other boroughs and census areas don't have, or at least when they do have, it's not as predominant a feature for growth or population loss. So Fairbanks in 2000, down around 80,000 people at that time, steadily grew through 2010 and reached just over 100,000 in 2012. The population declined a bit and then flattened out. And around 2016, started to see population losses, much like the rest of the state. So pretty much following the same trend as the state as a whole. Then between 2020 and 2021, we had impact from the military personnel moving in. So we see this jump in population for the borough. And at this time, we're not aware of any upcoming military movements to the borough, but there could be with what's going on in Ukraine. It's hard to say what will happen with our troop movements going forward. And then 2021 to 2022, small population loss here, but this is due to our surveying of military bases. So every year we survey every military installation in the state. And during 2021, we surveyed Fort Wainwright and we caught them in the middle of a troop transfer, it seems. So what happened was the troops that were coming up to Fort Wainwright were already here. The troops that were leaving had not left yet. So we caught them with some extra population in that area. And so our estimates were quite a bit higher in 2021 than 2020. And then if you look at 2022 is nearly about the same as 2020. So what's happened here is just kind of a one-off occurrence that we caught them in the middle of this troop transfer. Now, migration to Fairbanks, it's a little bit tougher to track migration to Fairbanks based on PFD applications. And there's a couple of reasons for this. In general, the military population does not file for PFDs at the same rate as the rest of the population. And so we may not be picking them up as much. And then the student population, we're relying on them to change their addresses on their PFD applications. And I know myself in college, my address was my mom's house. And so I'm imagining there's a lot of that going on. So while the magnitudes might be off slightly, the shape of this is likely to be accurate anyway, just by a rule of large numbers that in general we can get the shape right, but we're likely missing some people. So we're probably underestimating the number of people moving into the Fairbanks North Star Borough when we do these PFD by age migrations. But in general, similar to the state, lots of growth in that 2007 to 2012 period. But notably, Fairbanks does still lose population at these older years. And they continue to do so during every period that we have here. 2012 to 2017, every age group is negative. Again, the shape remains the same. And then 2017 to 2022, largely negative, but just barely positive in that 25 to 29. And that is likely due to military personnel moving in, and then kids returning to campuses, that sort of thing, kind of coming back to normal, see a little bit more migration into the borough. So births and deaths for Fairbanks, again, pretty similar to the state as a whole. Births a little bit noisier than the state as a whole, just because of smaller numbers, but we can clearly see kind of a rise in births here, or when the millennials start to hit these college ages. So you see an influx of people coming into the borough. And then as they would be graduating out, we start to see births kind of declining and then flattening out. And then again, like the rest of the state, births start to decline around 2016. And then kind of interestingly, beginning in 2020, we see this uptick in births for Fairbanks. And this is likely due to that influx of military personnel. These are people at prime birthing ages in general. And so we would expect to see births increase as you get more people in those 20s to 30s age groups coming into the borough. Births will likely increase. Now, deaths are interesting in that they don't increase as quickly as the state as a whole. And this is because Fairbanks just doesn't have as much of a older population as the state, at least proportionally speaking, as the state of a whole. So not as many people at those higher mortality ages. Now, between 2020 and 2022, obviously, again, large uptick in deaths. And Fairbanks deaths actually went from 484 between 2019 and 2020 up to 692 between 2021 and 2022. So that is a 43% increase versus a 39% increase for the state as a whole. So a little bit worse for Ware during the pandemic than the rest of the state. And so how has Fairbanks' population changed? Again, Fairbanks' population is unique and interesting in that it changes over. So, as people graduate from college, they might leave the borough for jobs, and then a new coming class comes in. Similarly, military personnel turns over, and, so then more age, excuse me, they don't necessarily age, they just kind of swap out. So we see the age structure in Fairbanks stay fairly steady with versus the rest of the state. And as you can see, at this point, the year 2000, baby boomers would be about 55. We don't see that big bump in in the age structure that we had for the state as a whole. So not as many baby boomers in the Fairbanks North Star borough as the rest of the state. So 2000 to 2005, still not a ton of growth at these older ages. We do see quite considerable growth at the 20s. As you can see, the male portion here is quite a bit larger. And this is very typical, just standard military population, predominantly male. These are the military ages. So we would expect to see this for an area with a large military presence. 2010, continued growth for Fairbanks, lots of growth at these military/college ages. Again, this makes sense. We have the millennials at their prime college ages. So we expect to see growth there. 2015, we start to see this 20s population decline a little bit. You can see the millennials starting to age out. 2020, further declines at these 20s, while the millennials continue to age, but still notably not a huge baby boomer population. At this point, baby boomers are starting to turn 75. So we don't have that big baby boomer population that the state as a whole does. And that's because Fairbanks tends to lose population a little bit sooner than the state as a whole due to migration. 2022, very similar to 2020. All right. Sorry. Do you have any questions?
At this point, I don't see any in the chat, and I'm not seeing any raised hands. Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Okay. Oh,
looks like we got.
Yep. Here we go. Go ahead, Greg.
Hi. A very interesting presentation. Particularly interested in the natural increase and births and deaths. But one thing that I think I disagree with is your characterization of the 1986 or 88 recession, 89 recession as being stimulated by, and population loss in that period is being stimulated by oil price drops. In fact, it was state spending on capital goods that caused what is classically described as an accelerator effect. And we built a lot of schools because of all the kids that were coming in with the construction workers. But when the capital budgets ceased to expand, they didn't even have to start reducing. They just had to stop expanding. The result was a significant recession, and that occurred before the oil price dropped, and the outmigration occurred before the oil price dropped, which of course exacerbated things, but it wasn't principally the reason for that 88 recession. It was state spending and the change in state spending that caused that. That's a comment, not a question. I guess the one question I had, and maybe it's an obvious answer, is what about the departure of the Stryker Brigade? Is that going to have any effects, or is that offset by other changes?
I'll have to check up on the departure of the Stryker Brigade. We haven't seen a big drop in our military surveys recently. It's been mostly growth the last few years. So I think if they've started departing at this point, we are seeing them being replaced, I guess. And that's a great point about the 80s. I mean, yeah, that's something that I wasn't aware of. But yeah, once construction stops and there's no construction jobs, that makes sense that the population would start to slide out of the state.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Jim Cully. You mentioned that the growth due to Eielson was done, yet the wing commander yesterday mentioned another 5 tankers coming, along with support staff and families and possible additional tankers coming. It doesn't sound like this has been taken into consideration. Is this the case?
I was unaware of that. Yeah. So every year throughout the year, not just during estimates time, we check the news and try to find out as many things as we can that are occurring. We survey military installations, but we like to be ahead of these things. So thank you for mentioning this. I will definitely look into it. But yeah, I had not seen that. So yes, if that's occurring, yeah, we would definitely expect to see growth if more brigades are coming in.
Okay, and we have another question in the chat from Miss Robin. The FNSB death rate increase in 2020 to 2022. Do you know if this is pandemic related?
Yes, yeah, it would be. We've definitely seen an increase in deaths all across the state. It's been kind of an interesting thing to see. Oh, interesting might be the wrong word, I guess, but it would definitely be related to the pandemic. It's not totally related to the COVID-19 virus itself, which is very interesting. The Health Analytics and Vital Records put out a great report on excess deaths recently, within the last 6 months anyway. And so we have this big uptick over expected deaths, but there's too many to be related to just be COVID-19. So there's a few other factors going on. It could be that people weren't going to the doctor, that sort of thing during the pandemic like they normally would have. But it's not exactly clear on what's causing all of the excess deaths that we've seen, but definitely would be related to the pandemic.
Okay, do we have any more questions for David? Ms. Robbins says thank you. And other than that, I'm not seeing any raised hands or questions in the chat. Oh, now there's one in.
Okay.
So this is from Dawn Harmon. So if the current birthing age group is smaller and this age group, not nationwide, is waiting longer to have kids, it sounds like the school age kids will continue to decrease in the future, which could mean fewer. Not sure if that's a question or more of a statement.
Right.
Schools needed. Is that correct? Yes.
Thankfully, I'm not in the position to have to make these decisions, but there will be fewer and fewer school-age kids in the coming future. So, but again, with Fairbanks based on Eielson, that area could need more schools if we continue to see troops coming in, bringing kids and that sort of thing. But in general, for the state as a whole, because births have declined so much, yes, we will see fewer and fewer children at that school age population level.
Okay, I am not seeing any more questions or raised hands. I would like to note that for the KC-135s, the additional oil tankers that were mentioned in an earlier question, the final basing decision has not been announced yet. So that's kind of part of the answer to that question. Do we have any more questions for David? Okay, thank you, David. That was a great presentation. I really appreciate it. This session was recorded and can be found on the FNSB Community Research Quarterly website soon. Our next session is on Wednesday, February 1, and we look forward to you joining us then. Have a wonderful day.